Welcome back to Adaptive Humans. I'm your host, Jami de Lou. Around here, we return to three anchors: how we navigate our emotions, how we adapt across differences, and how we steady ourselves when stress or triggers show up. Because that's what helps us stay human when life gets real. A quick content note for today. Today's episode includes discussions of cancer, medical trauma, and grief. If that's a tender subject for you, please do take care. Pause if you need to, and come back when you're ready. I will also say, to keep things light, you might hear us talk about poop once or twice during the episode. It's mid-March, which is Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month. You may have seen blue ribbons around, or maybe statistics shared online or when you're scrolling. Maybe you scrolled past something that feels distant, like, that's not me, not about me. Or you may have seen another young actor who has recently passed away from colon cancer far too soon. But today isn't about a ribbon or a person that you've watched on TV. It's about what happens when your body interrupts the plan, what it does to identity, to leadership, to how we define competence, to how we make decisions under pressure. In our last episode, we named decision debt. We talked about the accumulation of unmade, deferred, and reactive decisions that build when capacity is overtaxed. We talked about how invisible load doesn't just slow decisions, it compounds them. Today's conversation is what decision debt looks like when the stakes are not a strategy meeting or a quarterly review. It's what happens when the body becomes the constraint, or when someone you love goes through it. When the decisions that get deferred are the ones about your own health. When the signals are there and the system keeps reframing them into something more manageable. And we talk about what leadership looks like on the other side of some of these hard things. My guest today is Dacia Heck, a senior leader in customer success, operations, and organizational strategy. After losing her sister to early onset colorectal cancer, Dacia transformed her grief into action. She co-leads the GH Foundation, advocating for early detection and empowering people with the knowledge to advocate for their own health. With colorectal cancer now the leading cancer killer of men and women under the age of 50 in the United States, her mission has never been more urgent. Dacia, I'm so glad you're here. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yes, I know so many people will get so much out of this conversation, so I'm excited for us to dig in. Beyond the bio, this is where we meet the human behind the title or what they do for work. I know that working hard is a theme throughout your life. And one of the things the listeners might not know about you is that you graduated from college in 3 years. But instead of accelerating into the next thing, you actually took 6 months off, specifically to learn how to relax. What did you learn from that time?
Well, after graduation, I started with Anderson Consulting, and my start date was about 6 months after my graduation date. So I took the time to really enjoy spending time with family and friends. And after we had our discussion a few weeks ago, I was thinking back about that period of my life. And one of the jokes my brother-in-law shared and would joke about early on was that during that time, their couch at their home had an imprint of me because of me spending so much time on their couch. I moved back in with my parents and essentially couch surfed with family and friends during that 6 months, and just really enjoyed my life because I had gone so strong in college, graduating in 3 years. I had spent my summers working, going to school, taking a lot of credits each semester. So the way life turned out, 20 plus years later, I look back with that with fond memories and really wouldn't trade that for the world.
So, being a hard worker and knowing that you took this time and then sort of catapulted yourself into a career and a life that has had lots of windy roads, I'm certain many of our listeners can relate to that. How easy is it to ignore your own needs when you're working hard and maybe even putting your team at work first?
Think this is such a relatable thing for especially women in the workforce. Women especially, I think we tend to put our family, our work first above our own selves. And it's something that we need to start paying attention to. We need to pay attention to our own body, our own needs, because things aren't guaranteed. Our health, our lives aren't, tomorrow's not guaranteed. And it is so easy to just put everything before us. And I know it may sound cliche. It is something that we maybe hear all too often, but it is a life experience that I know for me personally, it was something that I heard about and I realized, oh yeah, that's not me. That's just somebody else who's trying to put their lives first. And my world came to a crashing halt in a moment of hours, and I realized that it's not somebody else. It can be me. It can be just anybody. Work and life can really change on a dime, and it is all too easy to fall into the trap of putting everybody else first and not really paying attention to your own body and not paying attention to your own needs.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you saying that. I think it's so easy until you're faced with something challenging or traumatic or hard, right? And when you know it can flip on a dime, it reframes things. But I think sometimes for some people they haven't experienced that, and in some ways I want to say God bless you for not having had that experience yet, but it can happen. And so a part of what we're going to talk about today is the incredible work that you're doing, and it's tied to your sister's story. And before we get into her diagnosis and what happened to her, in the spirit of like honoring your sister, tell us a little bit about who she was. What do you want people to know about your sister as a person before the diagnosis?
Yeah, my sister, she's my oldest sister. She was compassionate. She was a pharmacist. She had two children, married, was a local pharmacist, and it's one of those things where I don't know my pharmacist, and I live in a city, and maybe that's part of it. Maybe it's just who I am. But when we were out and about, people knew her, people talked to her. She seemed to know everybody. She worked out all the time. She was at the gym. She was a runner. So she knew people in the community, and it was one of those things where whether it's her personality, her job, I mean, people were drawn to her. And that may sound cliche, but it really was. Like, we couldn't go anywhere without her talking to somebody. And that's who she was. And we're going to talk about her diagnosis and how that's changed me and how it's changed our family. But it's something to remember, and it's something that I think really was special about her, and something that I don't wanna let the thing that is driving my foundation, who what drives me today, be overshadowed by who she was.
Yeah. And I think, that idea both for you personally is she was your big sister, but to so many people in her community, she was a pharmacist. And I know from what you told me, she ran like 8 miles a day, was highly active, really engaged with her family and her kids and the community as a whole. And so, in a lot of ways, someone who should have had every advantage when it comes to recognizing your own symptoms. And I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about today is that even with all the education and even a medical affiliated background, sometimes when it comes to things around gastro health, we can miss or ignore signs that might be there. And we're going to talk about that more as the episode progresses. But I'm curious, what does it do to your understanding of control over our circumstances when someone who seemingly was doing everything right, who was in the medical field, still didn't catch it in time? And I mean that with the most utmost respect. It wasn't her job to catch something, but that idea that it can still be such a quick process. And maybe for listeners' sake, for whatever you want to share in your sister's story, a little bit about how her diagnosis came to be to help people understand how quickly things could change on a dime.
Yeah, I mean, I try to be open about her diagnosis and how it came to be just because I think that it is so important to share her story because it's not a unique story. It is a story that at the time I had never heard, but now through the years that, since and through the advocacy work that I have, it is not unique. And it is something that is so important for folks to hear and to start speaking up if they have symptoms. My sister was 43 at the age of diagnosis. She was diagnosed with stage 4 colorectal cancer. She was, like I said, very active. The day she was diagnosed, she was running. My oldest niece said she remembers her running that morning. She was working out. She went to work. She started bleeding. She never ran a day of her life again. She never worked again. She started bleeding, went to the emergency room, had 17 units of blood transferred within 24 hours. Essentially, her colon started bleeding. Our tumor ruptured. She went into emergency surgery. She was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. She had lesions throughout her body that they found in her lungs, her uterus, her liver, her brain, you name it. It was everywhere. And I now look back and I think, wow, she ran so much and she had lesions in her lungs. It's just astounding to imagine what she did with the amount of cancer in her body. Superwoman in hindsight. But these stories aren't unique. And looking at her, she's 43. Screening age was 50 at the time. It's now 45 of folks of average risk, important to note. But she was in great shape. She wasn't a drinker. She was not a smoker. She was healthy, active, fit. So she wasn't your stereotypical colorectal patient. It is important to note that there aren't stereotypical necessary signs. This can impact anybody.
Yeah, and I think we talked about how easy it is, and maybe even more so if you are deemed sort of really active and healthy, that you might brush off something feeling wrong or off, and that other stressors, sometimes they just think, oh, that's something else, or oh, that's just because something else might be happening. What does it mean that her body was signaling and the signals kept getting reframed as something else? Because I know we talked a little bit about that reframing that can occur where it's not as though she knew that it was to this degree or what the ultimate diagnosis was when they found it, but the little things that people might miss, the signaling along the way.
Yeah, that's something that now in hindsight, as I've learned more, there were signs. At the time, they were brushed aside. The summer before my sister's diagnosis, my mom had some health issues, and I'll never forget. My sister was diagnosed in December. In October, my sister had said to me on a call, wow, with all the stress of just my mom's health issues, that she had lost 15 pounds. My sister was already very fit and very thin. Now I know that that was a sign, but given my sister's fitness level, it wasn't a, "Wow, you must have cancer." I knew for a long time my sister thought she was lactose intolerant, and maybe she was, but now I hear folks say that that's something that, with colorectal cancer, folks will think that they're lactose intolerant or, have symptoms of lactose intolerance. Again, just symptoms that just were brushed aside. And I'm not saying that everybody who's lactose intolerant, I don't want to come across as that, but these little things that in combination added up, but standing alone at 43 in great health overall didn't. But in hindsight, we always have 20/20 vision. And so now I could put all those pieces together and say, "Yeah, you should have been screened." But honestly, in the moment, I even today, I don't think I would put those symptoms together and say, "You should be screened," if somebody off the street said, "These are my symptoms."
One of the things we talked about was this idea of what's happening with your digestive system or the discomfort of talking about poop. And yes, I just said poop on a podcast, but this idea of what's happening in our bodies with our digestive system, we can sometimes ignore or be uncertain about. And I know just for a second to share with listeners, like my own experience with this, I had digestive issues, including lactose intolerance in my and all these different challenges. And oftentimes where people were putting it off, my doctor's like, oh, it's stress or this or that. And I finally got one doctor along the way in my 30s that was started doing all these tests and diagnostic and looking at even hooking me up to an EKG and looking at my, female anatomy and how that ties to digestion and all of these things. And I think he was doing a bit of research at the time, but no one was talking about a colonoscopy. And I happen to have very limited medical history. My mom was adopted at birth. I have very limited on my birth father's side. And so it makes it a little bit harder. And thankfully, I was in my later 30s able to not only have a really great primary care physician who, when I advocated for myself, advocated with me, but got access to a colonoscopy earlier. And they did find polyps and were able to remove them. And I think one of the things we haven't gotten into, but I know we're going to talk about is colon cancer is one of the most preventable cancers if the polyps are caught early and the importance of that. So sometimes because it's this topic of digestion and not wanting to speak about it, we're ignoring symptoms that are tied to something that is so preventable and so treatable with access to care. And so I'm just curious, like most people generally don't know that. And the knowledge that you have polyps or that someone in your family has polyps can actually make a critical difference in getting access to a colonoscopy earlier and getting, those polyps removed and or treatment. And so could you talk a little bit about that for listeners?
Definitely. It is so important to talk about your family history. And I'm so glad you mentioned not only colon cancer, but having a family history of polyps. That is such an important thing to talk about because if you have a family history of polyps, you need to be screened potentially earlier than folks of average risk being screened at 45. It's not just we have a family history of colorectal cancer, it's a family history of polyps as well. So not just looking at, the cancer, but polyps, they lead to cancer. And as you mentioned, colorectal cancer is the most preventable cancer if caught early. And it is something that if it's caught at early stages, there is a very positive prognosis to survival. People don't like to say the word colorectal cancer. People don't want to say rectal. It is something that I have learned and heard. I have friends in this community. It's a terrible community to be a part of. I don't want to be in this community, obviously. Nobody does, but once you're in this community, there are such amazing people. And I hear stories of how people react to hearing rectal cancer, and it is just astonishing, but again, that's why we're here. That's why we're here today talking about poop
Yeah.
and rectal cancer and
Yeah.
colon cancer and all those things that nobody wants to talk about, but it's so important. But please, if you have a family history of polyps or colon cancer or rectal cancer, please talk about it and talk to your GI because ultimately, or talk to your PCP. Not everyone has a GI, not everybody has a PCP. When you go in for your annual physical, talk to your doctor and say, hey, I have a family history of these things, and find out when they recommend screening.
Yeah, and for anyone that's not as familiar, your PCP is your primary care physician, and your GI is your gastrointestinal doctor, who your primary care doctor can refer you to. And I think even just having conversations with family members, maybe they don't know about polyps, maybe they're not aware of their own circumstances, but even starting to have conversations about digestive challenges or things like that. Ideally, you want to know if someone did have polyps, and asking those questions are so important, but if you have a loved one that is older than you and they don't know, it's also a good chance to encourage them and nudge them towards a colonoscopy to make sure they don't have polyps, right? Because it's never too soon or too late, right? To start to have those conversations. So, especially if you're talking to someone who has never had a colonoscopy and is at the age of 45 already, which is the sort of starting age in general right now. It moved down from 50 to 45, but that can be adjusted depending on your risk factors, your symptoms, everything else. So, what we want to make sure people take away from this segment is if you're having symptoms, absolutely talk to your doctor, absolutely have conversations because you don't have to say, oh, they're just going to write me off because I'm not old enough to have a colonoscopy. That's not actually the case. That's just where the standard of care sort of sits right now for the average person. Am I summarizing that right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, exactly.
Okay.
And when in doubt, talk to your doctor.
Yes.
Don't be shy. Don't
Yes.
feel like you're not old enough. Don't feel like nobody's going to listen. And if you don't feel as though you're being heard, talk to another doctor. Advocate for yourself. That's something that the foundation that we're going to talk about in a bit, something we really stress is advocate for yourself. You're your own best health advocate. And if you're talking to a doctor who's brushing off symptoms that you feel are important, go talk to another doctor, get a second opinion. It's your health, and ultimately it's your voice that you want to be heard, and talk to somebody else if the first person isn't listening.
Absolutely. And I hope that came through in the story that I shared about my own experience. The early doctors were not paying attention and were writing it off in different ways. And thankfully, with a different caregiver to help me, my primary care doctor, I was able to find out that I did have polyps and get them removed. And so I think this is a moment that leads us into our next segment, which is the brave enough moment. The brave enough moment is where we take a step before you can see the whole horizon. And so when I think about the brave enough moment, there's probably a million and one things that we could talk about in your story and your sister's story. But I'm thinking about after your sister passed and your advocacy work. I know you talked a little bit about initially doing some work under a larger organization and really wanting to turn your attention towards how could you spend your time and your money and really making that impact more directly. When did you know you needed to build something of your own that could make an impact? And how did you get started with the foundation that you have created?
While my sister was sick, I started doing research for organizations that focused on colorectal cancer and started volunteering because I knew that I'm a person who takes pain and I turn it into action. I am most at peace when I am busy. I worked with some colorectal cancer organizations. And after some time, my co founder of the foundation and we really sat back and we said, what's important to us? We kept coming back to the stigma around gastro health, the stigma around why folks aren't, you know, talking to their GIs, why they aren't talking to their doctors about their symptoms. And so that's where this foundation was born. There's amazing organizations that focus on colorectal cancer and after diagnosis. Our focus is really on breaking the stigma and targeting what we call the pre community, targeting folks who haven't been diagnosed to get them talking about things like poop and get them talking and being able to talk to their family about family history of GI disease, talking about something seems off and being comfortable advocating for themselves. So that's really why we started this organization and why we are focused on what we focus on. It is for breaking the stigma. So our motto is destigmatizing gastro health conversations because ultimately our goal is to break stigma.
I'm curious, what does stigma around colorectal cancer actually look like? Not in theory, but when you're really faced with the uncertainty or seeing people's faces and reacting to things, what is the stigma?
I think the stigma is in a lot of things. Stigma is folks not wanting to get a colonoscopy because they don't want a camera being put up, their back end. That's stigma. Saying the words poop, there's stigma in. I have a t-shirt that says check your colon, and I have worn it and people will make comments on, wow, you're brave for wearing that. And I am shocked by those reactions. I've had folks make comments that I've worn it in a workplace and somebody has made a comment of like, is that a message? And I just kind of think, I don't even see it anymore as even sending a message. To me, it's sending a message of get screened, check your colon. It's important. It will save your life.
Yeah.
That's a stigma that I've now kind of it's so second nature to me that when I see the reactions, it it makes me happy to almost get that reaction because that's what we're going for. We're trying to get folks to react, to start realizing that these things aren't uncomfortable. But there's a lot of stigma, there's cultural stigma.
Mhm.
We're trying to break it down. We're trying to also make it something that folks can really, make it fun. So our organization, we have mascots. So we have like a poop mascot, we have a colon mascot, and we have a plunger and Miss TP, which is like toilet paper. And ultimately our goal is to connect with folks, make them laugh, and trying to get the message out that GI health is important. And it's okay to talk about poop. It's okay to, if you have diarrhea and it's going on for a long time, it's okay to go talk to your doctor if it's abnormal. It's okay to bring up those words with your doctor.
The other thing I wanted to ask about is what do people under 50 need to understand that they don't really get right now?
As of January, the American Cancer Society has shared that colorectal cancer is now the number one cancer killer of men and women under 50 in the United States. It's something that the colorectal cancer community has been talking about. By 2030, this is going to be the number one cancer killer. I actually was looking up something and I saw something from last year that said for 2030, it's going to be the number one cancer killer for men and women under
Mm.
50. And as of, January, it was announced that it is now, we're there, and it's only 2026. So it is now my personal mission to knock it out of the number one seed, as I like to say. I say that with a lot of trepidation because I don't want any cancer to be the number one cancer killer. And I do not want to bestow this on another cancer by any means, but ultimately it is something that I think folks probably don't know. And it's not an old man's disease. That's what I thought when my sister was diagnosed. I had heard of colorectal cancer. I just thought it was for old people. You screened at 50, she was 43. The notion that she had stage 4 colorectal cancer was just so foreign to me. I had no clue, and obviously I've learned so much since then. But if I can share anything, that's the number one thing is it's now the number one cancer killer for men and women under 50.
Yeah, I think that's such an important thing for people to know, and especially in what we've been talking about in the episode. I completely get it. You don't want any cancer to be in number one spot, but for it to move that progressively, where in 2025, they thought it was going to take 5 years potentially to get to number one in people under 50, and it's there at the start of 2026 for men and women. I think it's so important for something that with early diagnosis or early removal of polyps, it doesn't even have to become cancer, right? The cancers they know the most about, like they understand how this works and it is so preventable. So we're just going to keep hammering that home during the episode because I think it's
Yes.
so
Yes,
important. Definitely.
exactly.
And I guess it's worth saying neither one of us are medical professionals, just as a disclaimer in this podcast. But with what you know in the foundation and the work you're doing, the screening guidelines are now recommend starting at 45 for average risk. But you've been clear 45 is not a magic number. And so, how has your family adjusted to risk factors and different needs based on their proximity to your sister?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned, I am not a medical professional by any means, but screening age for average risk is 45. But if you have a history of colorectal cancer, a history of polyps, you definitely need to talk to your GI. I have had 3 colonoscopies at this point. My nieces, who are my sister's daughters, they will start screening at the age of 25. So my sister was 43 at the age of diagnosis. However, the stage of progression that her surgeon did recommend that they start at 25. So there's a sayings that I've heard. It's like 10 years before the age of diagnosis of cancer. And that might be true for some, but talk to your GI, right? Don't just assume, oh, it's 10 years. I'm just going to follow that guideline because it's not always the case.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. If we could move a little bit into navigating amongst, God forbid, diagnosis and navigating it, there's a life aspect and a family aspect, but there's also a work aspect. And you talked a little bit about having a boss when your sister was diagnosed who was really supportive, and what a difference that that made for you at the time and didn't make you feel like your circumstances were a liability. How did that become a template for how you show up for your team as they navigate all kinds of different circumstances in their life?
Yeah, definitely. I had the privilege of working in a company that allowed me the space to be the present for my sister and her family during her treatment. I worked remote during that time. Upon my sister's diagnosis, she had lesions in her brain. She needed 24-hour care. And so with my nieces being young, they were 12 and 16 at the time, and my brother-in-law working, I fortunately was able to move in with them, and my husband would drive back and forth on the weekends, and my parents lived up the block, so it was kind of an all hands on deck family affair. And to this day, I am beyond grateful for that time. I would trade anything I could to not have gone through that experience, but I will share those 4 months of my life were probably the best of my life, and it's gonna sound weird to the listeners that I would say such a thing, but it was an experience that if I had to go through, I wouldn't change a thing about it. I would change having to be there, yes, but being in that moment, I would not have changed anything about it, and I am so grateful to have worked in a company that allowed me that space and allowed me the flexibility to, while I work is important, understood that my family was more important and give me that time and that space.
When I play that back, I think, there's a connection in some ways. The segment of Brave Enough Moment and how this kind of came to be was this idea of taking steps when you can't see what's around the corner and the outcomes. And so you have to make decisions sometimes, and obviously not all jobs are as flexible, and I've been in circumstances myself where as much flexibility wasn't warranted, and then I've been in some where it was completely warranted when I was dealing with a really significant situation like you were in this set of circumstances. And I think being able to trust yourself to make the choice. You have this 4-month window to be there for caring for your sister, but when you anchor back to the brave enough moment of even deciding after college that you're gonna take a break, where you got to spend some of that time being with her, there's these threads throughout your life where the choice could have been a million other things, and you still made the choice to show up for yourself or show up for your loved one. And I think that's sometimes that work can get so demanding and life can get so demanding. But a lot of us are being forced into choices now, especially those of us that are a certain vintage, we'll just say, of life, where you're facing caregiving in a different way, whether that's for a sibling, a parent, a loved one of some kind, or even people caregiving for their children. So I think, especially with a chronic illness of some kind, or in different instances like yours, where it was very sort of compact in this significant amount of time that you didn't realize it was gonna go as fast as it was going to go for your sister. And so I think this idea of making that choice and showing up and then having that support can help us, even ourselves, as we talk a lot about what it takes to lead others and be a good colleague and frankly be an adaptive human with others. And so showing up in that way, I just see a thread through. I'm not sure if it's something you've ever kind of thought about, but there is this element of making that choice and showing up, not necessarily knowing what the result's going to be on the other side in varying different circumstances, but tied to your family and ultimately tied to health.
I appreciate that actually. I really haven't thought about that. I actually really appreciate that. So, thank you.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
for tying that together for me. Sometimes, you have to
Yeah.
hear the 3 plays sometimes of your life, and you're like, "Oh, yeah, that did." And as I mentioned at the onset, just as I thought about as our conversation earlier, I thought back to some of the words my brother-in-law used to tease me about so much, and now I'm so glad I spent all those nights on my sister's couch and
Mhm. Mhm.
made my
Yeah.
permanent imprint on their couch, as they were recently married, and, the younger sister just moved in while she was couch surfing after college and learning how to relax.
Yeah.
But you turn back to, how it's really changed me as a leader. I see the role model that my boss at the time in the company. I still work for the same company, but it really helped form who I am now and how I lead my team. I really try to ensure that I lead with the same compassion. I try to, while we have a job to do and a work to get done, I really want to help ensure that I'm I'm leading by example. I try to help my team realize that we're people first, and that's what matters. At the end of the day, I want my team to know that they come to this position, they come to the job with all these things behind them and, their family, their friends, whatever their circumstance is. That's what's important at the end of the day. And they come to work, they're their whole being. And it's not just what we do all day, that I want them to show up and be their best selves at work, but that needs to also reflect them being whole outside of work. And so I really do try my best to support that.
Mhm.
We're all human. I'm sure I'm fallible at times, but ultimately I've always tried to be a good leader. But I think this journey with my sister and just seeing how quickly life changes and frankly seeing the lives that changed from my sister's experience. Our lives are changed forever. And so I try to remember that even at work and try to remember that while we're there for a purpose, we aren't everything. Our work isn't everything. And so I try my best every day at work to remember that we are just a part of my team. We're just a part of their day. And that what truly matters is everything that they have outside of work.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing your sister's story with us on the show and for trusting me and this space to be able to not only share her story, but share more about how people can learn about early detection of polyps, the risks of colorectal cancer, the impacts of people who are now under 50 and the risk factors there as well is actually a good time, I think, that leads us to the third segment, which is our Just Be Reset. The Just Be Reset is where we take time to consider how we can ground ourselves and just take a moment to breathe, to release, to reset. And I feel with a topic like this that can feel heavy at times, and even for you, as many times as potentially you've told this story, it can even affect you in different ways. And I know it's made me think about a lot of things while we've been here. And so, what I like to do with the Just Be Reset is really practically help share with listeners what are things that you can do. We both know that our careers can be very demanding. They can take up a lot of who we are. The advocacy work is also demanding. And that journey with grief, when you layer all of those things on top, it can take a lot from us. And so I'm thinking, by your own account, you've shared that it's easy to get caught up in working long hours. You know that there's a gap between what you know and what you do sometimes. And so, how do you help yourself reset? What do you do to take breaks? Travel? What helps you?
I probably don't practice all that I preach, but one thing I'd love to do is travel. Actually, my husband and I have started going to Italy for a month each year. We work from there, but that has actually been a really great reset. So we are fortunate enough to have that opportunity to be able to work remote. So that is my reset.
I mean, it's a beautiful country to reset in.
It really is. It really is. And we're taking Italian, so
That's
it's
fun.
yeah,
And actually
just
learning a new
another thing on the
language,
pile.
a lot of people don't realize this, but also learning a new language, it's reframing and even physically being in a different space. This is why they talk about vacation actually helps your brain neurologically, like, because you're having to think, not just work on autopilot. We get up, we do our thing, we know our city, we go to where we need to go. And there's actually something about if you have the ability to travel, it actually can help. The reset is real, and it's not just because it feels good, but it's actually doing something different to your brain and it's helping reset. So there is actual real
Well,
research around it.
yeah, and actually we find that with the time change. it's really nice because we work in the dark. I'm not a night person, but working in the dark and being out all day is really what helps us the most because we really reclaim the daylight. And I think that shift really, really helps a lot.
That's awesome. So I'm curious, how can someone who maybe doesn't see the lack of boundaries that's needed and trying to bring it into focus, right? Because we know seeing it and changing it aren't the same thing. And you talked about even how you yourself, admittedly, right? It gets hard sometimes. What's like one small thing you could do that kind of helps shift that boundary into focus to ensure you're allowing those resets that are needed in the day to day?
I'm probably not the right person to ask that. I have a really hard time with boundaries. I tend to let things blur a lot. If you ask my husband, he would say, "What boundaries when it comes to me?" But I'm going to give the answer of I think ultimately really trying to find the one thing that's important to you. For me, my family, I really do think over the last, you know, 8 years, my family has really become what's my priority, my direct family, my extended family, and really trying to find those moments that we can spend time together. So even if it means I have my laptop open and I'm doing a family event, just having that time. That's my reset. That's what I find value in.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your honesty because I think a lot of people will relate to that because it's not easy to set the boundaries all the time. And it's not easy to manage a really demanding, busy career and family life. But how you really do make ways to prioritize it is really great. So, one of the things I try to do on each episode is share some kind of reset that we can do in the moment. And I'm not going to force you to do it on camera with me, but I'd like to take us through a box breathing exercise. And one of the things that I love to share with people is that it doesn't have to be something you do that's highly visible. So, box breathing, if you're not familiar with, is where you breathe in for 4 slowly, you hold your breath for 4 slowly, you exhale slowly for 4, and then you kind of hold your breath at the bottom of that exhale for 4, and you do this in a boxed way. And so, what I thought could be interesting, if you're open to it, is there's a way to sit and do this breath, but it doesn't have to be overtly noticeable, right? So, I'll do it a little bit more noticed, and you can just do it like you're sitting in a meeting and chaos is around you, but you just kind of need to reset. So, we're just going to play. This is a role play. I did not prep you for this before. So, if anyone is watching the video, they'll get to see. If not, most people are listening anyway. And so, they're just going to hear me take them through the breath. So, no judgment free zone. But I think it's important for people to know that this is something really easy you can do that does not have to be visible to everyone else. Does that work? We'll try
It's
it?
great.
Okay, awesome.
Yep.
So, what we're going to do is I'm going to have us take a breath in for 4, hold for 4, release for 4, and hold for 4. So, I'm going to do it by showing you. So, we're going to go in for 4. So, what I did was the noticeable in for 4, I breathed in, I held for 4, and then I exhaled loudly through my mouth for 4, and then held for 4. But I didn't hear you breathing at all. So either you were holding your breath or if you were doing the activity, my point is to tell people this does not have to be an overtly apparent thing to everyone around you. But box breathing is among the many different types of breath work that can be a simple, short thing that you can do to help recalibrate yourself and reset your own nervous system in a moment of stress. It could be something you do when you have that 20 seconds, 30 seconds between calls, you're back to back, or if you're live with people and everyone's talking around you and you just need to settle yourself. It's just an idea of what you can try. How did that feel
Love
for
it.
you?
I actually was at a taping of Kelly and Mark, I think it's called now. My
Yeah.
sister loved Kelly and Regis and Kelly and
Okay.
then Kelly and Ryan. And so when we were in New York last year with my youngest niece, we went to a taping of Kelly and Mark now.
Oh, fun.
And they had somebody doing breathing. And so I do it now at night when I go to sleep because I
Hmm.
don't sleep well.
Hmm.
So anyway, that was great. I love it. So I should try it more in the day. And I never do things like that during the day. So
Yeah.
I'm going to try it. during the business day.
But I'm glad you said that because actually probably the time that I do the most box breathing myself is I too, if I'm not careful, like insomnia just tries to be the X that won't let go. And so I often do box breathing when I'm laying in bed to just try to, because I'm so focused on the breath that it starts to relax me as well. So I think it's also another commonplace. So I'm glad you shared that with us. Regulation and all of that, breath work and the different things that we do is meant to make advocacy possible. And so, Dacia, I just want to say to you, thank you so very much for sharing your story and journey with leadership and advocacy work. And thank you for honoring us with your sister's story and the impactful work that you're doing through the GH Foundation. And so, what I'd love to do as we're wrapping up is thinking about those who maybe would benefit from a rapid fire. So, if it's okay with you, I have a few rapid fire questions that we will wrap up with.
Great. Sounds good.
A symptom people normalize for too long is
Blood in their stool.
good one. A sentence everyone should feel comfortable saying to their doctor is
Something doesn't feel right in my body.
absolutely. One myth about colorectal cancer I'd retire today is
Only old people get it.
yes. The statistic I can't stop thinking about right now is
Colorectal cancer is the number one cancer killer for men and women under 50 in the United States.
so important. A leadership value this experience sharpened in me is
Leading with compassion is important, and leading by example is even more important.
yes, so important. Deja, thank you again for your honesty, for the work that you're doing, and for trusting me and this conversation so that we could share it with others. I feel like as March, being Colorectal Awareness Month, anything that we can do that raises awareness and really demystifies and reduces the stigma, people can go back and maybe we'll have a contest of who can submit first in the comment sections. How many times did we say poop in the episode? That is so important. And I'm here to be with you in ending the stigma. So thank you again for joining me today.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for shining the light on this important topic.
I'm so grateful to have Dacia on the show today. And what I hope you all take away and really hear is this: your body is not separate from your ambition. It is not an inconvenience to override. It's information. Emotional intelligence helps us name what's true. Cultural intelligence reminds us not everyone has equal access to screening, medical advocacy, or family health history. And nervous system regulation gives us just enough steadiness to ask better questions instead of shutting down. Because this episode is airing during Colorectal Cancer Awareness Month, we've linked to the Graham Heck Foundation and Project Blue in the show notes. May this episode help even one person get early screening for polyps or advocate differently for themselves with a doctor. We will have moved the needle of eradicating colorectal cancer. Think about how we can be driven in our work and living in a dynamic life without stopping to listen to our bodies or recognize potential symptoms. If you want to take a simple step this month, you can wear blue, share accurate information, demystify and say the word poop, have the uncomfortable conversation, or schedule a screening. Don't be afraid to talk about polyps or poop. Prevention is not panic, it is agency. Take a breath, make the appointment, advocate for yourself. I know that I am here to tell my own story of early detection and removal of polyps because I advocated for myself, even with limited family history. And if this episode resonated, share it with someone who needs the reminder that their bodies are not the enemy. Adaptability isn't about pushing through. It's about listening sooner. Until next time, I am brave. I am enough. I am brave enough, and so are you. This is Adaptive Humans, real talk, intentional growth.